In the heart of ancient Judea, beneath the sweltering heat of the Middle East, there was a village called Bethany. Not far from Jerusalem, this simple place would be the scene of one of the most extraordinary miracles ever witnessed by humanity. There lived three brothers: Martha, a practical and diligent woman; Mary, contemplative and deeply spiritual; and Lazarus, a man of unshakable faith, loved by all who knew him. But what makes this story so unique is not just its characters, but the special bond they shared with a man named Jesus of Nazareth. It was no mere acquaintance. The sacred text tells us explicitly, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. A love that transcended the ordinary, a friendship that would be tested to the limits of human understanding. The air was heavy that afternoon when Lazarus began to feel the first symptoms. A fever that initially seemed common quickly turned into something much more serious. The sisters, desperate, sent messengers to find Jesus. "Lord, the one you love is sick." A simple message, charged with urgency and hope. Jesus' response, however, was disconcerting. Instead of rushing to his dying friend's side, he remained where he was for 2 more days. "This sickness is not unto death," he said, "but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Cryptic words that at that moment offered little comfort to the grieving sisters. Meanwhile, in Bethany, Lazarus's condition was rapidly deteriorating. The room was filled with the scent of medicinal herbs and oils as local healers tried in vain to contain the disease. Martha alternated between caring for her brother and scanning the horizon, hoping to see the approaching silhouette of Jesus. Mary stood by the bedside, holding Lazarus's increasingly cold hand, her tears falling silently onto the linen sheets. And then, in the agonizing silence of that house, came the last breath. Lazarus, the beloved brother and friend of Jesus, was dead. What no one could have predicted was that this apparent end would be just the beginning of a story that would echo through the centuries, a demonstration of divine power that would defy the boundaries between life and death. Death was not strange to that society. In first-century Judea, life expectancy rarely exceeded 50 years. Diseases that we consider simple today routinely claimed lives. For Jews, however, death carried deep meanings, specific rituals, and a spirituality that permeated every aspect of mourning. Lazarus was not an extraordinary man in terms of social status or wealth. His home in Bethany, though comfortable, was simple. Limestone walls, a central courtyard where the family gathered on warm evenings, and small rooms where his brothers found their rest. What made him special was his ability to build genuine relationships, his quiet generosity, and his unwavering faith. A middle-aged man with a beard already streaked with grey, and eyes that revealed both wisdom and kindness, Lazarus was respected in the community as a righteous man. His sisters, so different from each other, shared a love for their brother. Martha, the eldest, ran the household with impressive efficiency. Her days began before dawn, baking bread, organizing household chores, making sure everything ran smoothly. Her hands, calloused from constant work, were rarely idle. Mary, on the other hand, was contemplative. She was often lost in deep thought, searching for meaning and spiritual connections in everything she saw. Together, the three siblings formed a harmonious family nucleus, whose doors were always open to travelers and friends. It was on one such occasion that Jesus first entered their lives. What began as hospitality to a traveling teacher turned into a deep friendship. Jesus became not only a spiritual teacher to them, but a close friend who knew their joys and fears. Bethany became for Jesus a refuge where he could rest from the crowds that constantly sought him out. "I have never seen the rabbi so at ease as when he is here," one of the disciples once commented, observing Jesus laughing carelessly at a story told by Lazarus. When the illness came, it was like an unexpected storm on a clear day. It started with Lazarus complaining of a headache during dinner. The next day the fever came, insidious at first, then overwhelming. "I've seen this fever before," murmured the old doctor who was hurriedly summoned. Few survive when it reaches this intensity. The sisters' reactions revealed their natures. Martha intensified her efforts, consulting healers from neighboring villages, preparing herbal poultices, keeping vigil without allowing herself any rest. "There must be something more we can do," she insisted, refusing to accept the inevitable. Mary, for her part, alternated between moments of deep prayer and silent despair. When she was not at her brother's side, she was sitting alone on the terrace, her eyes fixed on the horizon, tears flowing freely. "If Jesus were here," he whispered repeatedly, like a mantra of hope. It was Martha who made the decision to send a messenger to Jesus across the Jordan. "Don't say he's dying," she instructed the young messenger. "Just say, 'Lord, the one you love is sick.' He will understand." The messenger set off immediately, the urgency in his steps reflecting the gravity of the situation. The journey would take at least a full day, a day that would prove all too precious. The news reached Jesus while he was teaching a small group. His face, always so expressive, revealed a shadow of sadness. The disciples expected an immediate departure for Bethany, but Jesus' answer surprised them. "This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God," he declared, continuing his activities as if nothing had happened. "Master," Thomas finally dared to ask, "shouldn't we go to Bethany? Lazarus is your friend." "We will stay 2 more days," Jesus replied, with a certainty that none of them understood. Meanwhile, in Bethany, Lazarus's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The fever was sapping his strength, leaving him delirious at times and lucid at others. In the brief windows of lucidity, he asked for Jesus. "He will come," Martha assured, with more conviction in her voice than in her heart. On the 3rd day of his illness, as the sun set over Bethany, painting the sky blood-red, Lazarus breathed his last. Mary, holding his hand, let out a scream that echoed through the hallways of the house. Martha, in the courtyard, preparing yet another remedy, dropped the container and it shattered on the stone floor, a sound that seemed to mirror her heart breaking into pieces. The Messiah had not arrived in time. The friend was dead, and with him, the sisters' faith in the man they called their master seemed to have died. In Jewish culture, the time between death and burial was brief, usually no more than 24 hours. The heat of Judea did not allow for delays. As soon as news of Lazarus's death spread, the house in Bethany quickly filled with neighbors and friends. Older women arrived to assist in the ritual of washing the body. Men organized to prepare the family tomb, a cave dug into the rocky hillside not far from the house. The professional mourners, with their ritualized laments, created an atmosphere of palpable sadness. For Jews, expressing grief was not only permitted, it was expected, encouraged, a way of honoring the deceased. The sound of weeping and funeral chants echoed through the narrow streets of Bethany, announcing that a life had been lost. Martha moved mechanically, organizing the practical details of the funeral, greeting visitors, accepting the offerings of food that arrived from all directions. Her normally expressive face had become a rigid mask. Only her red, swollen eyes betrayed the tears shed in those rare moments of solitude. "Where is your friend Jesus?" asked a neighbor, not maliciously, just curious. "I thought you would come." Martha hesitated only a moment before answering in a controlled voice. "He will come when he can." But deep inside him, a storm of conflicting emotions was stirring. Where was Jesus? Why hadn't he come? He who had healed strangers, why had he not saved his own friend? Maria, unlike her sister, completely surrendered to the pain. Confined to her room, she refused food and comfort. Her sobs could be heard through the closed door. When he finally emerged hours later, his eyes were dull, as if his inner light had been extinguished along with his brother's life. "He said he was the resurrection and the life," she whispered to Martha when she finally found the words. "I believed him, Martha. With all my heart, I believed him." Lazarus's body, now ritually purified, was wrapped in linen cloths, soaked in myrrh, aloes, and other aromatic spices, an expensive process that reflected the love they had for him. A cloth covered his face, preserving his dignity in death. In the evening, a silent procession carried the body to the family tomb. Lazarus was placed in one of the inner chambers, and a large circular stone was rolled away to close the entrance. For Jews, the soul remained close to the body for 3 days after death, a belief that intensified mourning in those early days. The ritual of Shiva, the 7 days of intense mourning, began immediately. The house was prepared, mirrors were covered, low stools were positioned for mourners to sit on, lamps were kept burning continuously. Meanwhile, beyond the Jordan River, Jesus finally announced to his disciples, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going to wake him up." Confusion was evident on the faces of his followers. Had he fallen asleep? This was good news. It meant that the health crisis had passed. So why did Jesus look so serious? "Master, if he sleeps, he will get better," replied Philip, expressing the general thought. "Lazarus is dead," Jesus said with a frankness that surprised them. "And I am glad for you that I was not there so that you may believe. But let us go to him." The disciples exchanged worried glances. Returning to Judea was dangerous. On his last visits to Jerusalem, the religious authorities had made clear threats against Jesus. Returning meant risking everything. "Let us also go so that we may die with him," said Thomas, with a fatalism that hid his courage. The group set off at once, walking at a brisk pace. The journey would be long, at least a full day's journey. Jesus stood at the front, his face bearing a determination his followers had rarely seen. In Bethany, the 4th day since Lazarus's death dawned. According to local beliefs, on this day the soul finally left the body, making death irreversibly final. For the sisters, each passing hour seemed to solidify the painful reality. Lazarus was gone forever. The house was still full of visitors, including religious leaders and influential people from Jerusalem who had come to pay their last respects. Many came out of curiosity to see the sisters who were known to be close friends of the controversial Nazarene rabbi. Whispers and speculation circulated among those present. "They say he heals the sick and even raises the dead. Then why didn't he save his friend? Perhaps his powers have limits after all." It was Martha who first received the news. A young man from the village, out of breath from running, entered the courtyard announcing, "Jesus is coming. He's on the road to Bethany." Martha's heart leapt. Too late to save Lazarus, but not too late to bring comfort. Without telling anyone, not even Mary, she hurried out of the house, determined to find Jesus before he arrived, driven by a conflicting mix of relief, heartbreak, and a faint hope that even she did not fully understand. Martha ran down the dusty road, her mourning veil flapping in the wind. Her heart was pounding, not just from the physical exertion, but from the emotional storm that was consuming her. 4 days. Jesus had waited 4 days. Why? The question rang in her mind as her bare feet made their way along the rocky path. She saw him in the distance, surrounded by his disciples, walking with that calm determination that always characterized him. Her legs wobbled for a moment. What would she say to him? The words she had rehearsed in her mind seemed inadequate in the face of the reality of the encounter. But Martha had always been the sister of action, not of contemplation. She straightened her body and continued toward him. Jesus looked up and saw her. Something in his eyes, a mixture of compassion and an inexplicable certainty, made the tears Martha had been holding back for days threaten to spill over. He paused, waiting for her, while the disciples quietly stepped back, giving them space. "Lord," the words came out broken with emotion as they finally came face to face, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." It wasn't an accusation, although it might have sounded like one. It was the cry of a broken heart, the verbalization of a pain that sought understanding. But then, still with tears in her eyes, Martha added something surprising. "But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask for." Jesus looked deeply into Martha's eyes. "Your brother will rise again." "I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day," she replied, referring to the Jewish belief in a final resurrection. a distant future belief that offered little solace for present pain. It was then that Jesus spoke words that would echo through the centuries, a statement that transcended that specific moment. "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live, and whoever lives and believes in me shall never die." Do you believe this? The question hung in the air, charged with meaning. It was no abstract theological question. It was personal, urgent, life-changing. Jesus was not merely offering future comfort. He was declaring authority over death itself, here and now. Martha, looking into the eyes of that man whom she knew so well as a friend and yet did not fully understand as a teacher, felt something resurface within her, a spark of faith that grief had temporarily obscured. "Yes, sir," she replied, with a conviction that surprised even herself. "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world." That declaration of faith, uttered on the side of a dusty road by a grieving woman, was one of the most profound confessions recorded in Scripture. Unhesitating, unconditional, a complete affirmation of Jesus' identity at a time when it would have been more natural to question it. "Where is Mary?" Jesus asked softly. "In the house, with those who came to comfort us," replied Martha, suddenly remembering her sister. "I will call her." Martha quickly returned home, now with a different step, no longer driven by grief alone, but by a mission. She found Mary sitting on the floor, surrounded by professional mourners and friends from Jerusalem. Leaning over, she whispered in her sister's ear, "The Master is here and is calling for you." The effect of these words on Mary was immediate. She stood up so abruptly that she surprised those present and left the house without explanation. The visitors, interpreting her sudden departure as a trip to the tomb to weep, followed her. Mary found Jesus still in the same place where Martha had left him. Upon seeing him, he fell at his feet, a gesture he had made before, not in despair, but in devotion. Now it was both. "Lord," she sobbed, repeating Martha's words exactly, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus' reaction to Mary's weeping was profoundly different from his theological dialogue with Martha. Seeing her weeping, and the Jews who accompanied her also in tears, something extraordinary happened, something that would reveal a rarely seen dimension of Jesus. He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. The original text suggests an intense emotion, almost like an inner tremor of indignation at the power of death and the suffering it caused. The Word made flesh, experiencing human pain in its fullness. "Where did they put him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And then, in the shortest and perhaps most eloquent sentence in Scripture, a glimpse of Jesus' full humanity. Jesus wept. Silent tears streamed down the face of the one who had declared himself to be the resurrection. They were not tears of despair, but of genuine compassion, God incarnate weeping with those who weep. Those tears of Jesus provoked immediate reactions among those present. Some of the Jews, observing the scene with curiosity, murmured among themselves, "See how he loved him." Others, however, were critical even in the face of that moment of vulnerability. Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept Lazarus from dying? Jesus' weeping was not a demonstration of weakness, but a revelation of the depth of his love. He who commanded the winds and calmed storms allowed himself to be touched by human pain. His omnipotence did not make him distant from suffering. On the contrary, it seemed to intensify his empathy. The crowd was now moving toward Lazarus's tomb. It was an unusual procession. Jesus in the lead, flanked by the two sisters, his disciples close behind, expressions of confusion on their faces, and a crowd of Jews following them, some genuinely moved, others just curious about what would happen next. The family cemetery was located on a rocky slope not far from the house. Rock-cut tombs were the common method of burial for families of moderate means. A narrow entrance led to inner chambers where the bodies were laid to rest. Lazarus's tomb, as was customary, had been sealed with a large circular stone that was rolled across the entrance. a physical barrier between the world of the living and the dead. When they arrived, the afternoon sun was shining on the rocky hillside, creating long shadows. Mary was sobbing silently, leaning against Martha, who had an enigmatic expression after her conversation with Jesus. There was something in her eyes, a spark of hope, mixed with apprehension. "Take away the stone," Jesus commanded, his voice now firm and authoritative. A stunned silence followed his words. Removing a stone from a tomb after 4 days? The idea was unthinkable, even repugnant by Jewish cultural standards. It was Martha who voiced the general concern. "Sir, it already stinks, for it has been 4 days." His objection was not just practical, it was also a reminder of the cruel reality of death. After 4 days in the hot Judean climate, Lazarus's body would have been in an advanced state of decomposition. The 4th day marked in Jewish belief the time when even the face would begin to deteriorate, rendering the person unrecognizable. Jesus looked at Martha with an intensity that seemed to penetrate her soul. "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" Those words echoed the promise he had made days earlier when he received the news of Lazarus's illness. "This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God." The circle was beginning to close, but few understood what was about to happen. Hesitantly, some men approached the tomb. Placing their strength against the large stone, they began to roll it aside. The grinding of stone against rock created an almost palpable tension. When the entrance was finally revealed, a distinctive odor escaped from the burial chamber, confirming Martha's fears. The disciples exchanged apprehensive glances. What did Jesus intend? Some began to back away discreetly, fearing what might happen next. Others, like John, stood firm, their eyes fixed on the Master, a quiet confidence in their faces. The crowd reacted as well, some covering their noses with cloths, others whispering speculations about Jesus' intentions. The religious leaders present looked on with disapproving expressions. Touching or exposing a dead body caused ritual impurity, a serious transgression for an observant Jew. Jesus, however, remained serene. He raised his gaze to the sky in a posture that everyone recognized as prayer, but his words did not follow the traditional formulas of supplication. "Father, I thank you that you hear me. I know that you always hear me, but I say this for the sake of the people standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." It was a peculiar prayer. It asked for nothing, but simply gave thanks for something that seemed to have already been granted. Later, the disciples would understand. Jesus was not initiating a petition at that moment, but revealing a continuous and unbroken communion with the Father, a harmony of wills that transcended conventional notions of prayer. Mary held her breath, her fingers gripping Martha's arm tightly. Despite her deep devotion to Jesus, what was happening defied her comprehension. Martha, on the other hand, felt her heart pounding. "If you believe, you will see the glory of God." The words reverberated in her mind as a promise and a challenge. Then Jesus turned toward the dark entrance of the tomb. The crowd held their breath as if time itself had stopped. In that moment, suspended between life and death, between faith and doubt, Jesus did something inexplicably simple and utterly extraordinary. In a loud voice, echoing against the rocky walls of the cemetery, he called, "Lazarus, come out!" The silence that followed Jesus' command was absolute. No one breathed, no one moved. Time seemed suspended, as all eyes were fixed on the darkness of the tomb's entrance. For an eternal moment, nothing happened. And then a noise. Not just any noise, but the unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps, fabric brushing against stone. From the darkness of the tomb emerged a figure that defied all human understanding. Lazarus, still wrapped in the burial cloths, his face covered by the shroud, moving with difficulty toward the light. "Untie him and let him go," Jesus ordered, his calm voice contrasting with the collective shock that had silenced the crowd. Chaos erupted instantly. Women screamed, men fell to their knees, some fled in panic. Mary collapsed, her legs unable to support her at what she was witnessing. Martha, paralyzed between disbelief and ecstasy, stared at the one who had been her dead brother and now stood before her, breathing, moving, alive. Two of the disciples, overcoming their initial stupor, hesitantly approached Lazarus and began to remove the wrappings that had wrapped him. Layer after layer, the linen soaked in aromatic spices was removed, gradually revealing not a decaying body, but intact, healthy skin, pulsing with renewed life. When they finally removed the cloth covering his face, Lazarus's eyes, confused but vivid, blinked against the sunlight. "Martha, Mary," were his first words, his voice hoarse from disuse. The sisters ran to their brother, wrapping him in a desperate hug, touching his face, his arms, as if to confirm that it was not an illusion. Tears of joy that surpassed words flowed freely. "Jesus called you back," Mary whispered between sobs. "You were dead, Lazarus." "For 4 days!" As the family was reunited in a death-defying embrace, the crowd of witnesses was divided in contrasting reactions. Many of the Jews present, confronted with the undeniable evidence of the miracle, fell to their knees in worship. "This is truly the Messiah," they declared, abandoning decades of skepticism in an instant of revelation. Others, however, especially the religious leaders who had come from Jerusalem, were backing away, their faces contorted with a mixture of fear and anger. Without exchanging words, but with looks full of meaning, some of them quickly walked away, taking the road that led to Jerusalem. Nicodemus, a member of the Sanhedrin who had met Jesus secretly in the past, watched from a distance. His face revealed the inner conflict that consumed him, the truth he witnessed with his own eyes versus his loyalty to the institutions of which he was a part. "What wrong have we done that you would give us this sign?" asked a young Pharisee standing next to him, his voice shaking with confusion. "The question is not what we did wrong," Nicodemus replied almost to himself, "but what we shall do now with what we have seen." Meanwhile, apart from the tumult, Lazarus sat on a rock, supported by his sisters, trying to comprehend what had happened. His last conscious thought had been the sensation of sinking into darkness as the fever consumed his last strength. And now, here he was, in the afternoon sun, surrounded by the scent of wildflowers and the perfume of spices that still permeated his skin. "Where have I been?" he murmured, his eyes lost in a distance no one else could see. I was... But words failed him, unable to translate an experience that transcended human language. Jesus approached silently and placed his hand on Lazarus's shoulder. Their eyes met in a moment of profound communication that needed no words. Something passed between them, a knowing, an understanding that would remain a shared secret. Among the disciples, new questions arose. "What does this mean for all of us?" Andrew whispered to his brother Peter. "If he can call the dead back to life, it means nothing will be the same again," Peter replied, his voice a mixture of fear and exaltation. Thomas, ever the skeptic, watched the scene with a transformed expression. "Seeing is believing," he murmured, tears streaming freely down his bearded face. On the road to Jerusalem, messengers were already running with the news. Within hours, the information would reach the temple courtyards, the corridors of Caiaphas's palace, and the ears of the Roman governor. A man who had been dead for 4 days walked among the living again. The implications were immeasurable. In Bethany, the house that hours before had been a scene of mourning was rapidly transformed. Servants rushed to remove the symbols of mourning, rekindle lamps, prepare food. The news spread through the small village like wildfire. Neighbors who had brought food for the mourners now returned with wine and musical instruments. Martha, eternally practical, was already organizing a meal for everyone while trying to comprehend how her life had been turned upside down twice in 1 week. Mary simply could not take her eyes off her brother, as if she feared he might disappear if she blinked. And through it all, Jesus watched, aware that this miracle, the greatest of all the signs he had performed, had set in motion events that would culminate in his own encounter with death. A death that, unlike Lazarus's, would be necessary for his ultimate purpose. Night fell over Bethany, but no one slept. Lazarus's house, lit by dozens of lamps, pulsed with feverish energy. The man who had returned from the dead sat in the center of the inner courtyard, surrounded by visitors who kept arriving. Some came to witness the miracle with their own eyes, others to touch the one who had crossed the veil between worlds and returned. Lazarus answered the questions with short, fragmented sentences, not because he was rude, but because he could not translate into human words what he had experienced. How can you describe colors to someone who has been blind since birth? How can you talk about the taste of honey to someone who has never tasted it? His eyes, once warm and expressive, now seemed to carry an unfathomable depth, as if he could see this world and another simultaneously. "Is it true that you were dead?" asked a young man, with that disconcerting frankness of youth. Lazarus looked down at his hands, turning them over, as if seeing them for the first time. "I remember the cold creeping up my fingers," he finally answered. "I remember hearing Martha and Mary crying, but I couldn't tell them I was all right. And then darkness, and then a light that doesn't hurt the eyes but nourishes the soul. And then—" He paused, his eyes searching for Jesus across the courtyard. "Then I heard my name being called, not as a sound, but as if my entire being vibrated in response, and I had no choice but to turn back." In a far corner, Maria watched her brother with a complex mix of emotions. The joy of his return was undeniable, but there was something else, a nagging feeling that the Lazarus who had returned was not quite the same as the one who had left. Not just because of the distant eyes or the hesitant speech, but because of something more fundamental that she could not name. "He looks lost, doesn't he?" Martha whispered, approaching with a tray of freshly baked bread, as if part of him is still somewhere else. "Do you think he—" Maria hesitated, unable to finish the question that was tormenting her. "Would he have preferred to stay there?" Martha added, always the more direct of the two. "Maybe. Imagine seeing what he saw, and then being pulled back into this." She gestured to the crowded house, the noise, the confusion of life. The weight of this thought settled upon the sisters. They had prayed desperately for their brother's return, but they had never considered that perhaps, from his perspective, the callback might be experienced not as a gift, but as an interruption. "I asked Jesus for this," Mary confessed, tears shining in her eyes. "I begged him to do something." "What if it's selfish on our part?" Martha put her hand on her sister's shoulder. "It is not up to us to question God's purposes. If Jesus brought him back, there is a reason greater than our understanding." Across the courtyard, away from the crowd surrounding Lazarus, Jesus' disciples gathered in small groups, processing what they had witnessed. For them, the miracle had disturbing implications. "If he raised Lazarus after 4 days," Philip reasoned, "why doesn't he raise everyone who dies? The widow who lost her son yesterday, the child who died of fever in the neighboring village. We cannot fathom all his ways," replied John, the youngest and often the most insightful of the disciples. "Remember what he said, 'This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God.'" There was a specific purpose here. Peter, ever impulsive, seemed more concerned with practical matters. "Do you realize what just happened? He defied death itself. The Sanhedrin will never allow this to go unanswered." Their fear was not unfounded. At that very moment in Jerusalem, the high priest Caiaphas was calling an emergency meeting of the Sanhedrin. Around the stone table, under the flickering light of oil lamps, the most powerful men in the Jewish nation were arguing in raised voices. "This man performs many signs," one of them declared, concern evident in his voice. "If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. Then the Romans will come and take away both our holy place and the nation." The fear was palpable, not just of Jesus, but of the political consequences. A messianic movement centered on Jesus could easily be interpreted by Rome as rebellion, resulting in brutal repression. Caiaphas, with the authority that his position gave him, slowly stood up. A heavy silence fell over the room. "Ye know nothing," he said, articulating each word with deliberate precision. Neither consider ye that it is expedient for you that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. His words, recorded by the evangelists, carried a divine irony that he himself did not understand. Without knowing it, he prophesied the true nature of the sacrifice that Jesus would make, not only for the Jewish people, but for all humanity. In Bethany, oblivious to the machinations in Jerusalem, Jesus watched the celebration with an unfathomable expression. He knew exactly what his act had triggered. The raising of Lazarus was not just a sign of his power over death, it was the catalyst that would accelerate his own journey to Calvary. Dawn brought new crowds to Bethany. The news of Lazarus's resurrection had spread like wildfire, attracting pilgrims who were already heading to Jerusalem for Passover. The small, normally peaceful village was transformed into an improvised pilgrimage center. Tents sprang up in the surrounding fields, merchants took advantage of the unexpected opportunity, and the dust kicked up hundreds of feet made the air thick and difficult to breathe. Lazarus, exhausted by the constant attention, had retreated to the inner rooms of the house. Martha, ever efficient, tried to manage the incessant flow of visitors, setting limited times for audiences with her brother. Mary acted as guardian, protecting Lazarus's privacy when he needed rest, something he seemed to need just as much before his death. "It's strange," she commented to Jesus when they found a rare moment of tranquility on the terrace of the house. "I thought that after returning, he would be different, stronger perhaps, but he seems as human as before." Jesus looked at her with a gentle smile. "And what did you expect, Mary? Your brother was not transformed into another being. He was called back to the same flesh, with the same limitations. The resurrection he experienced is not the final resurrection that awaits all of God's nations. The resurrection he experienced is not the final resurrection that awaits all of God's children. So he might die again?" The question came out almost as a whisper, filled with renewed fear. "Yes," Jesus replied simply, "your body is still mortal." The realization fell upon Mary like a physical weight. The miracle, extraordinary as it was temporary. One day, perhaps in decades, perhaps tomorrow, they would face the loss of Lazarus again. "Then why?" she asked, unable to hold back her tears. "Why bring him back, only to have him face death a second time?" Jesus placed his hand on hers. "Do you remember what I said to Martha? I am the resurrection and the life. The sign I gave Lazarus is not about extending his mortal life indefinitely. It is a glimpse of the power that breaks the permanent chains of death. It is a promise of what is to come." His eyes, always unfathomable, seemed to look beyond the present moment to events that Mary could not glimpse. "Soon you will understand better." Meanwhile, on the roads connecting Bethany to Jerusalem, darker movements were taking place. Temple soldiers, disguised as ordinary pilgrims, moved among the crowd, observing, recording names, identifying close followers of Jesus. Under direct orders from Caiaphas, they were not to intervene yet, only to gather information. "The Nazarene spends his nights at the house of Lazarus," one of them reported to the captain of the temple guard. "The disciples accompany him, except one, Judas Iscariot, who often wanders off alone after dark. Keep watching this Judas," the captain ordered. "Men who distance themselves from their groups often have reasons that we can explore." In another part of Jerusalem, Nicodemus, the member of the Sanhedrin who had met Jesus secretly years earlier, was writhing in inner agony. He had heard Caiaphas's words at the council meeting and understood the implications perfectly. The decision to eliminate Jesus had already been made. All that remained was to find the moment and the method that would not provoke popular unrest. "I cannot remain silent," he muttered to Joseph of Arimathea, another secret member of Jesus' sympathizers. "To condemn a man without a proper trial violates our own law." "And what do you intend to do?" Joseph replied, concern evident on his aged face. "To openly oppose Caiaphas is to sign your own sentence of ostracism. You will lose everything: position, respect, influence." And if I remain silent, I will lose something even more valuable. Nicodemus replied, a new resolve forming within him. On the evening of the second day after the resurrection, an unexpected visitor arrived at Lazarus's house. He came not through the main entrance where crowds still gathered, but through a side path used by the servants. It was Malchus, a slave and personal attendant of the high priest Caiaphas. "I need to speak to Jesus of Nazareth," he said to Martha, who intercepted him in the backyard. "I have an urgent message." Suspicious, Martha hesitated. "Who sent you?" "I have come on my own," Malchus replied, fear evident in his eyes. "I have heard things in my master's house that the rabbi needs to know. There is a plan afoot." Led to a room where Jesus was talking with some disciples, Malchus prostrated himself, visibly trembling. "Stand up," Jesus said gently. "Speak without fear." "Master," Malchus began, his voice little more than a whisper, "the Sanhedrin has decided that you must die. Not only that, but—" He hesitated, swallowing hard before continuing. "They plan to kill Lazarus as well, to eliminate the living evidence of your power." A heavy silence descended upon the room. Peter instinctively reached for the short sword he carried beneath his robes. John and James exchanged alarmed looks. Jesus, however, remained unfazed. There was an acceptance on his face, as if he had received confirmation of something long awaited. "Why do you warn us?" asked Thomas, ever the skeptic. "You betray your own master." Malchus touched his right ear unconsciously. "I had a dream," he answered, his voice trembling. "A dream as vivid as reality. In it, I was in a garden at night. There was confusion, swords, and my ear was cut off. But then," his eyes fixed on Jesus with a mixture of awe and wonder, "then you touched it and restored it. I woke to the warmth of your fingers on my skin." Jesus looked at the man with compassion. "Your faith was born of a dream that is yet to come," he said enigmatically. "Let not your heart be troubled. All will happen as it is written." Block 8. Further development of subplots and connections between characters. After Malchus left, the disciples broke out into heated discussions. The threat was now concrete, not only against their master, but also against Lazarus, whose only crime was to be the object of a miracle. "We must leave immediately," insisted Simon the Zealot, accustomed to thinking in terms of strategy and survival. "We can take refuge beyond the Jordan, or further north in Galilee." "And abandon all who came seeking healing and hope?" Philip asked. "There are hundreds camped out there, waiting for just a touch, a word." Jesus watched the discussion without intervening. His eyes revealed a serenity that contrasted with the agitation of the disciples. Finally, he raised his hand, and there was immediate silence. "No one takes my life from me," he said, his voice calm but full of authority. "I lay it down of my own free will. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again." The enigmatic words hung in the air, incomprehensible to the disciples who could not yet conceive the nature of the approaching sacrifice. Meanwhile, in the inner chambers, Lazarus sat alone, absorbed in thoughts he shared with no one. Since his return, there were times when he seemed present only physically, his spirit wandering in regions inaccessible to the living. The door opened silently, and Mary entered with a basin of cool water and clean towels. "I brought it so you can refresh yourself before the evening meal," she said, placing the basin on a low table. She hesitated, then added, "Jesus said that Malchus brought troubling news." Lazarus looked up, meeting his sister's eyes. "They want to kill me again," he said, with a strange calm. "Isn't it ironic? I've spent my whole life fearing death, and now that I've tasted it, they think they can threaten me with it." Maria sat beside her brother, taking his hands in hers. They were warm, pulsing with life, a tangible miracle that she could not yet fully comprehend. "Don't talk like that," she pleaded, "as if you don't care about going back there." Lazarus smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's not that I don't care about life, Maria. It's just that I now know that what awaits us is infinitely more beautiful than we can imagine, but I also understand that I still have a purpose here." He gently squeezed his sister's hands. Everyone has their own appointed time. Mine was extended for a reason, and I will not waste it in fear." In the outer courtyard, Martha oversaw the preparations for the evening meal, but her mind was elsewhere. The news brought by Malchus had shattered the brief illusion of normalcy she had tried to rebuild. For one glorious moment, she had believed that all would be well. Her brother was back. Jesus was being cheered by the crowds. Now the shadow of threat loomed over them again. "Always the practical martyr, busy with many things," said a familiar voice behind her. She turned to find Jesus watching her, an expression of affection on his face. Something about the way he knew her, truly knew her, always disarmed her. "Someone needs to make sure everyone eats," she replied, trying to maintain normalcy, "especially now with so many visitors." Jesus approached, helping her arrange the bread on a large tray. "Do you know what I admire about you, Martha? Your ability to find order in the midst of chaos, to create structure when everything seems to be falling apart." "What's the point?" she asked, her voice finally breaking. "I organize the house, take care of everyone, and then they decide that my brother must die again, that you, who gave us so much hope, must be eliminated." Jesus put his hand on her shoulder. "Remember what I told you at the tomb? If you believe, you will see the glory of God. That has not changed, Martha. Human plans cannot thwart God's purpose." Outside, in the makeshift camp where hundreds of pilgrims waited for a chance to see Jesus or Lazarus, another drama was quietly unfolding. Judas Iscariot moved among the crowd, seemingly just watching, but his eyes registered every detail. Merchants selling amulets with supposed miraculous powers, itinerant healers taking advantage of the atmosphere of anticipation, pilgrims laying generous offerings for the disciples. A man approached discreetly, the same temple soldier who had been watching him for days. "Impressive, isn't it?" he said, as if he were just an ordinary pilgrim. "All this, trading around miracles." Judas stiffened momentarily, but kept his expression neutral. "What do you mean?" "I'm just observing how a clever man could take advantage of this situation," the undercover soldier continued. "Or perhaps help control a situation that could quickly become dangerous for everyone involved." Their eyes met for a meaningful moment. "The high priest is willing to discuss appropriate compensation for useful information," he added quietly. Judas did not respond immediately. Something in his face, an internal conflict, a struggle known only to him, flashed briefly before being suppressed. "I don't know what you're talking about," he finally replied, walking away toward the house. But his mind was already calculating possibilities, rationalizations, justifications. On the eve of the departure for Jerusalem, a special dinner was prepared in Jesus' honor at the house in Bethany. Passover week was approaching, and the holy city, just a few miles away, was already bustling with tens of thousands of pilgrims. Martha had gone above and beyond in her preparations. The finest wine, freshly baked bread, perfectly seasoned lamb. It was her way of expressing gratitude through the meticulous service that characterized her personality. Lazarus was reclining at the table next to Jesus, a position of honor that did not go unnoticed. His living presence was in itself a continual testimony to the power working through the Master. The disciples occupied the remaining seats, forming an intimate circle in what would be, although no one yet knew it, one of the last moments of tranquility they would share. It was then that Mary entered the room, carrying an object that immediately attracted everyone's attention, an alabaster jar. It was no ordinary vessel. Its elegant design and precious material indicated that it contained perfume made from pure nard, an extremely valuable substance imported from the distant East. Without saying a word, Mary approached Jesus and, in a gesture that left everyone astonished, broke the seal of the vessel. The intense, sweet aroma instantly invaded the room, so concentrated that one could almost taste it. Then, in an act of extraordinary devotion, she poured the contents over Jesus' feet and, letting down her long hair, something a respectable woman would never do in public, began to dry them. What an absurd waste! The sharp voice of Judas Iscariot broke the sacred moment. This perfume could have been sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor. 300 denarii represented roughly the annual wage of a common laborer, a significant fortune. The text records that Judas spoke not out of concern for the poor, but because he was responsible for the common purse and frequently embezzled funds. Before Mary could defend herself, Jesus intervened. "Leave her alone," he said, with unusual firmness in his normally gentle voice. "She has saved this perfume for the day of my burial. The poor you will always have with you, but me you will not always have." An uncomfortable silence followed. Burial! The explicit mention of his imminent death fell like a stone into the festive atmosphere. Mary, still kneeling at Jesus' feet, looked at him with eyes full of painful understanding. She had understood what the disciples, in their reluctance, still refused to accept. "She did what she could," Jesus continued, softening his voice as he gently touched Mary's shoulder. "She came forward to anoint my body for burial." Martha, observing the scene, felt a pang of recognition. Months earlier, he had criticized Mary for sitting at Jesus' feet while she worked. Now, he finally understood. His sister possessed a spiritual intuition that transcended her own practical devotion. Mary had sensed what was coming and responded with an act of worship that would be remembered for generations. Outside the house, the scene was quite different. News about Lazarus continued to attract ever larger crowds. What had begun as curiosity now turned into a movement that deeply alarmed the authorities. "It is uncontrollable," one of the temple spies reported to Caiaphas in the darkness of a private room in Jerusalem. "They are openly calling him the Messiah, the King of Israel. Some have even abandoned the temple, saying that the God who raises the dead has no need of animal sacrifices." Caiaphas listened with a grim expression. The implications were catastrophic, not only for his religious authority, but for the delicate peace with Rome. Any suggestion of a Jewish king would be interpreted as rebellion, resulting in violent repression. "The decision has been made," he declared finally. "The Nazarene must die before Easter. As for Lazarus," he paused, considering the complexities of the case. "He presents a different problem. To kill him after his resurrection might make him a martyr. For now, concentrate on Jesus." Back in Bethany after dinner, Judas wandered off alone into the olive groves that surrounded the property. The incident with the perfume had crystallized something inside him, a bitterness that had been growing silently for months. As he walked among the ancient trees, he mentally replayed recent events, reinterpreting them through the lens of his growing disenchantment. Jesus was not the political Messiah he had hoped for, the one who would free Israel from the Roman yoke. Instead of mobilizing his growing number of followers for a revolution, he wasted opportunities, spoke of death, and accepted extravagant gestures like Mary's. 300 denarii poured at his feet, he muttered to himself, the resentment evident in his voice. "While we talk about feeding the poor and helping widows." A figure emerged from the shadows, the same temple soldier who had approached him earlier. "The high priest is willing to offer compensation for the correct information," he said without preamble. 30 pieces of silver to whoever facilitates a discreet arrest away from the crowds." Judas stared at the man for a long time, the inner conflict reflected on his face. Finally, he asked the question that would seal his place in history. "What exactly do they want from me?" The morning dawned with extraordinary clarity, as if nature itself anticipated that this would not be an ordinary day. Pilgrims who had camped around Bethany were waking up, preparing for the short journey to Jerusalem. Passover, the most important celebration in the Jewish calendar, was approaching, and the holy city was already overflowing with more than 250,000 visitors. Jesus called his disciples together early in the morning. "Go to the nearby village," he instructed 2 of them. "You will find a colt tied there, an animal no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here." If anyone asks why you are doing this, tell them that the Lord needs it and will return it to them shortly." The disciples exchanged puzzled looks, but obeyed without question. When they returned with the animal, they began to understand. An ancient prophecy by Zechariah declared that the Messiah would enter Jerusalem riding on a colt, the foal of a donkey. For the first time, Jesus seemed to be giving up his usual anonymity, allowing a public demonstration of his messianic identity. Lazarus, who had been watching the preparations, approached Jesus. "Let me accompany you," he asked, a new determination in his voice. "My presence at your side will be a testimony they will not be able to ignore." Jesus nodded, placing his hand on his resurrected friend's shoulder. "Your story is now intertwined with mine in ways that even you don't fully understand." The news that Jesus was on his way spread quickly. As the group began to descend the Mount of Olives, a crowd had already formed along the road. People gathered palm branches, traditional symbols of victory and national celebration, and waved them, creating a green and gold carpet for the donkey to walk on. "Hosanna!" they shouted in unison. "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel." The word Hosanna, literally "save us now," carried electrifying political connotations. For many in the crowd, it was a cry of national liberation, a call for the Messiah to drive out the Roman oppressors. Among the followers, it was not difficult to identify those who had witnessed the resurrection of Lazarus and now spread their testimony, pointing to the man who walked beside Jesus. "Look, it's him, the man who was dead for 4 days." As they approached the city, the spontaneous procession grew exponentially. From atop the walls of Jerusalem, Roman guards watched with growing apprehension. Any gathering during Easter was viewed with suspicion. A crowd cheering a king was potentially explosive. In the upper chambers of the temple, Pharisees and Sadducees watched in horror. "Look," said one of them, "the whole world is going after him. All our planning, and now he enters the city in triumph." When Jesus finally walked through the gates of Jerusalem, the entire city seemed to vibrate with anticipation. The narrow streets were completely blocked by people trying to catch a glimpse of the one they called a prophet, a healer, or even the Messiah. But instead of heading to the palace or starting a political revolution, as many expected, Jesus went directly to the temple. What happened next would remain etched in the memory of everyone present. The outer court of the temple, originally intended to be a place of prayer for all nations, had become a chaotic marketplace. Money changers exploited foreign pilgrims with exorbitant fees to exchange impure money, bearing images of Caesar for acceptable coins for offerings. Vendors offered sacrificial animals at inflated prices, often rejecting those brought by pilgrims themselves on the grounds of imperfection. Jesus watched the scene for a few moments, a growing indignation evident on his face. Then, in a sudden movement that took everyone by surprise, he began to overturn the money changers' tables, scattering coins across the stone floor. Improvising a whip with ropes, he drove out the animals and their sellers. "It is written," he declared with thundering authority, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all people, but you have turned it into a den of thieves." The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time, many saw not only the gentle and compassionate Jesus, but the manifestation of divine, righteous indignation. The vendors, after the initial shock, fled, leaving their goods and money behind. Lazarus, witnessing it all, was simultaneously terrified and elated. This was the same man who had called him back from the dead, now exercising authority over the temple itself, challenging not just corrupt merchants, but the entire system that allowed such corruption. By evening, when Jesus and his followers had retired to the Mount of Olives for the night, news of the day's events had reached Caiaphas. The high priest called an emergency meeting. "We can wait no longer," he declared, his face contorted with fury. "This man has challenged our authority in the temple itself. The situation is explosive. The Romans will not tolerate rioting during Passover." It was at that moment that a messenger entered discreetly, whispering something in the ear of one of the high priest's assistants. The assistant, in turn, approached Caiaphas. "One of his followers, the one called Judas Iscariot, has sent word. He is willing to help us." The days that followed in Jerusalem had an almost unreal quality, a building tension that everyone could feel but few fully understood. Jesus continued to teach daily in the temple, drawing ever larger crowds. His parables and teachings, always provocative, now became decidedly confrontational. He spoke openly about religious hypocrisy, about coming judgment, about the rejection of God's true messenger. The Jewish authorities, frustrated by Jesus' popularity that prevented a public arrest, waited for the opportunity promised by Judas. The traitor moved between two worlds, sharing meals with Jesus and the disciples, while secretly finalizing the details of his capture. Lazarus had become almost as controversial a figure as Jesus himself. His living presence was a testimony that could not be easily refuted, and many believed in Jesus precisely after seeing or hearing about the one who had returned from the dead. They asked constantly about the other side. Lazarus confided to Mary as they walked through the streets of Jerusalem, keeping a discreet distance from the crowd surrounding Jesus. "As if I could describe the indescribable." "And what do you answer?" asked Maria, watching as people pointed and whispered as they recognized her brother. "I tell you that death is not the end we fear," he replied, "but neither is it the answer to all the questions we have. I tell you to look to Jesus. He is the complete revelation of all that I have only partially glimpsed." On Thursday of that week, a different atmosphere hung over the group of followers. Jesus had requested special arrangements for the Passover meal, specific, almost mysterious instructions about a room in the city. When evening came and everyone gathered, they realized that for the first time in days, it was just the 12 disciples and the Master, a moment of intimacy amid the public turmoil. Lazarus, Martha, and Mary, respecting Jesus' desire for this private time with his closest disciples, remained in Bethany. Mary, especially, felt an inexplicable restlessness. "Something is going to happen tonight," she told her brothers as she watched the sunset from the terrace of the house. "I feel like we're on the edge of an abyss." In the upper room in Jerusalem, Jesus shared his last meal with the 12. The atmosphere was solemn, charged with meanings that the disciples were only beginning to intuit. In an extraordinary moment, Jesus stood up, took off his outer garments, and, like an ordinary servant, began to wash the disciples' feet. "What I am doing you do not understand now," he said to Peter's shocked protest, "but you will understand later." So, a moment of absolute tension. As they shared the bread and wine, Jesus made an announcement that fell like a thunderbolt upon those present. "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." The shock was instantaneous. Confused looks were exchanged, vehement denials were made, and anguished questions were asked. "Is it me, Lord?" each one asked, unable to imagine such a betrayal. Judas, sitting strategically out of Jesus' direct line of sight, remained in calculated silence. His mind was already made up, the deal sealed, the money in his purse, the information about where Jesus could be found away from the crowds already relayed to the temple guards. Jesus, showing that he knew exactly what was coming, offered Judas a piece of dipped bread, a traditional gesture of honor at a dinner party, and said softly, "What you are about to do quickly." And the other disciples, still not understanding, assumed that Jesus was sending Judas to buy something necessary for the feast or to distribute alms. Only the betrayer and the betrayed fully understood the significance of that moment. As Judas disappeared into the night, Jesus continued the meal with a new purpose, instituting what would become known as the Last Supper. Taking bread, he broke it and said, "This is my body, given for you." Over the cup of wine, he declared, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." Mysterious words, almost incomprehensible to those present, but which would echo through the centuries, being remembered in rituals by billions of followers yet unborn. After the meal, Jesus led the 11 disciples out of the city through the Kidron Valley to a place called Gethsemane, a garden of olive trees at the foot of the Mount of Olives. There, as the night wore on, he experienced his most human moments: anguish, fear, loneliness. "My soul is exceedingly troubled, even unto death," he confided to Peter, James, and John as he went away to pray. The disciples, exhausted by the intense events of the week, fell asleep while their master agonized in prayer, sweating drops that the sacred text describes like blood. Elsewhere in Jerusalem, Judas led a group of temple guards and Roman soldiers, armed with torches, swords, and staves. The kiss, the agreed-upon signal to identify Jesus in the darkness, weighed on his conscience like lead. But he had crossed the point of no return. Jesus' fate and his own were sealed. In Bethany, Lazarus woke abruptly from an uneasy sleep. Something had woken him, not a physical sound, but a deep sensation, as if an invisible thread connecting him to Jesus had suddenly been pulled taut. "It's started," he murmured to the dark room. The news of Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane spread like wildfire in the early morning. When the first rays of sunlight touched the walls of Jerusalem, there was already whispering about the hasty trial before the Sanhedrin, the false witnesses, the accusations of blasphemy. Lazarus, Martha, and Mary arrived in the city out of breath, having run all the way from Bethany. The streets were abuzz with conflicting rumors. Some said that Jesus was about to be released, others that he had already been handed over to Pilate, the Roman governor. "We have to find him," Maria insisted, desperation evident in her voice. "After everything he's done for us, we can't abandon him now." Lazarus, however, grabbed his sister's arm, stopping her. "Don't you understand? That's why you brought me back." His eyes reflected a painful clarity. "My resurrection was the final catalyst. After you raised me from the grave, they could no longer ignore you or just ridicule you. They had to kill you, or accept you completely." A growing clamor came from the direction of the Antonia fortress, the official residence of the Roman governor. The crowd gathered, voices raised in a terrible chorus. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" The same people who just 5 days ago were shouting Hosanna were now calling for blood. The fickleness of public opinion, manipulated by religious leaders, was manifested in its rawest form. When they finally fought their way through the crowd, they saw Jesus being led out, a purple robe thrown over his bloodied shoulders, a grotesque crown of thorns pressed onto his head. His face, barely recognizable beneath the swelling and blood, maintained an unearthly dignity. Maria covered her mouth with her hands, a choked cry escaping through her fingers. "No," she whispered, "not like that." Jesus' eyes, scanning the hostile crowd, met briefly those of Lazarus. In that fleeting moment, a silent communication passed between them, the risen one and the one who would soon face death by his own choice. There was no plea for help in that look, no supplication, only a confirmation of the purpose that united them. The funeral procession moved out of the city, Jesus carrying his own cross, until, weakened by the scourging and loss of blood, he collapsed under its weight. The Roman soldiers recruited a Cyrenaican named Simon to carry the remaining cross the rest of the way to Golgotha, the place of the skull. Lazarus and his sisters followed at a distance, along with a small group of faithful followers, mostly women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene. The pain on their faces contrasted sharply with the looks of satisfaction among the religious leaders who had orchestrated the condemnation. The crucifixion itself was carried out with the brutal efficiency for which the Romans were known. Experts in slow, painful death, they had refined this particular method into a sinister art of public humiliation and prolonged agony. As the nails were hammered through Jesus' flesh, Martha turned her face away, unable to witness. Maria, however, kept her eyes fixed, as if enduring some of the pain by simply refusing to look away. Lazarus watched with an understanding unique among all those present. Having experienced death, he knew its cold embrace, that terrible transition that his friend and Savior now willingly faced. "Why doesn't he come down from the cross?" asked a spectator. "He raised Lazarus from the dead. Why doesn't he save himself?" The question reverberated through Golgotha, echoing the mockery of the priests. He saved others, but he cannot save himself. The irony was completely lost on them. The power that had called Lazarus from the tomb could just as easily have released Jesus from his torments. The same authority that had commanded, "Lazarus, come forth," could have summoned legions of angels to intervene. But this was a deliberate sacrifice, not a defeat, but the culmination of an unfolding divine plan. At noon, an unearthly darkness descended upon the earth, as if creation itself could not bear to witness the suffering of its creator. For 3 hours, under that veil of darkness, the agony continued. Then, with a cry that transcended the physical, Jesus exclaimed, "It is finished," and gave up his spirit. At the same moment, the ground shook violently. In the temple, miles away, the veil separating the Holy of Holies, the place of the divine presence, was torn from top to bottom by an invisible force. Lazarus felt something break inside him too, not in despair, but in sudden, overwhelming understanding. His resurrection had not just been a sign of Jesus' power, but a harbinger, a prefiguring of what was to come. His own story was incomplete without this final chapter. The death of the one who was the resurrection and the life itself. "He knew," Lazarus whispered to his sisters as they watched Jesus' body being taken down from the cross. "From the beginning, he knew that bringing me back would mean his own death." "But why?" sobbed Martha. "Why choose this path?" "Because," Lazarus replied, a growing certainty in his voice, "what he did for me was just a taste of what he plans to do for everyone." The Sabbath that followed the crucifixion was the longest and darkest that Lazarus, Martha, and Mary had ever experienced. They returned to Bethany in silence, each lost in his or her own thoughts. The house that had been the scene of an extraordinary miracle now seemed empty, devoid of the presence that had filled it with life and hope. "He said he was the resurrection and the life," Mary murmured, sitting still by the window, watching the setting sun paint the sky red. How could he himself succumb to death? Lazarus, who rarely spoke about his experience beyond life, seemed strangely calm. "Do you remember what he said when he learned of my illness? 'This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God.' Perhaps his own death will follow the same principle." Sunday morning brought with it the first timid light, when urgent knocks on the door woke them up. Mary Magdalene was there, panting from running, her eyes wide in an expression that mixed shock and something that seemed almost joy. "The tomb," she gasped, "is empty. The stone has been rolled away, and the body is not there." The words hung in the air like disoriented birds, incomprehensible in their enormity. Lazarus was the first to react, hurriedly getting dressed. "Show me," he said simply. The road to Jerusalem has never seemed so long. When they finally arrived at the garden where Jesus' body had been laid to rest on Friday, they found Peter and John already there, standing perplexed before the open tomb. The linen cloths were neatly folded inside the burial chamber, the shroud that had covered the face laid aside. "It's not a robbery," John said, his eyes shining with dawning understanding. "Thieves would have taken the bandages along with the body, or left them scattered in their haste." Lazarus entered the tomb, a shiver running down his spine as he remembered his own experience. The cold stone walls, the distinct odor, it was all painfully familiar. But there was something different here. It wasn't just the absence of a body, it was a tangible presence, as if the very air vibrated with contained energy. "He has kept his promise," Lazarus whispered, his voice breaking. "As he called me from the grave, so now he has called himself." The apparitions began that same day, first to Mary Magdalene, then to other disciples, reports of encounters with Jesus, not as a spirit or ghostly apparition, but bodily present, solid enough to be touched, to share meals with. When Jesus finally showed up at the house in Bethany a week later, there was no shock or disbelief, just a sense of a full circle. Lazarus, more than anyone else, instantly recognized the one who had also crossed the chasm between death and life. "Now do you understand?" Jesus asked softly, extending his nail-marked hands toward his resurrected friend. "Yes," Lazarus replied, tears streaming freely down his face. "My resurrection was only a sign, pointing to yours." "More than that," Jesus corrected. "It was a promise. What I did for you, temporarily and limitedly, I now offer to all permanently. You have returned to the same mortal life. I have made way for a life that death can never touch again." Mary, ever the contemplative, first understood the magnitude of what was being said. "That is why you allowed Lazarus to die, even though you could have healed him from a distance. You needed to demonstrate your power over death itself before you faced your own." Jesus smiled, that smile that seemed to illuminate not only the environment, but the very heart of those who beheld it. The greatest sign demanded the greatest sacrifice. The greatest love required the greatest surrender. In the days that followed, as Jesus continued to appear to the disciples and hundreds of others, Lazarus himself became a living symbol, not only of the resurrection past, but of the promise to come. His story was now inextricably linked to the larger narrative of redemption and hope. "Before," he confessed to his sisters, "I thought of my resurrection as something personal, a miracle granted by friendship. Now I see that I was only an instrument, an anticipated echo of the event that split human history in two." Decades later, when the evangelist John would record these events for future generations, he would choose the resurrection of Lazarus as the last and greatest of Jesus' signs before his passion. Not by chance, but because this story, more than any other, demonstrated the central truth of the gospel. Divine power over death, manifested first in a beloved friend, then in the Savior of the world himself. The story of Lazarus remains to this day one of the most powerful biblical accounts, not only because of its intrinsic drama, but because each of us can see ourselves in it, called from darkness to light, from death to life, by a voice that knows our name and has authority over our most desperate condition. As Jesus asked Martha on that crucial day in Bethany, he now asks each of us, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live." Do you believe this? Call to action, final friends and loved ones. The story we share today, the raising of Lazarus, is not just a historical account preserved in the pages of the Bible. It is a narrative that continues to echo through the centuries, touching lives and transforming hearts, just as it did that day in Bethany. Just as Lazarus was called out of the tomb, each of us faces moments in our lives when it seems we are trapped in impossible situations. Circumstances that seem as final as death itself. Relationships are shattered, dreams are shattered, hopes are fading like daylight at dusk. But the powerful message of this story is that there is a voice stronger than our circumstances, a voice that calls our name and has authority over even the tombs we build around us. Reflect for a moment. In what areas of your life do you need to hear that voice calling, "Come out"? What blinders need to be removed? What stones need to be rolled away? The story of Lazarus teaches us that no matter how much time has passed, 4 days or 4 decades, it is never too late for a new beginning. The same Jesus who wept with Mary and Martha, who raged against the power of death, who called his friend back to life, is alive today and continues to perform miracles of restoration and renewal. If this message touched your heart today, I invite you to take 3 practical steps. First, take some time this week to read the entire account in John chapter 11. Dive into the words for yourself, absorb every detail, allow the story to come to life in your imagination. Second, identify the graves in your own life, areas where you have been stuck, limited, and hopeless. Commit these situations in prayer to the one who has proclaimed himself to be the resurrection and the life. Third, share this message with someone who needs hope. Maybe you know someone facing their own version of a sealed grave, a scary diagnosis, a broken relationship, a devastating loss. Be a channel of this life-changing truth for them. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to continue receiving these biblical narratives that challenge, comfort, and inspire us. Next week, we'll explore another powerful story from Scripture that continues to transform lives to this day. Always remember, just as Jesus called Lazarus by name, he knows your name too. And his voice still has the power to open graves, remove bandages, and call you to abundant life. Until the next video, and may the peace that surpasses all